The London Blitz started 80 years ago, more or less to the day. And it was an effort by the Nazi government of Germany to break both the morale and the industrial capacity of Britain, to make it want to just surrender and get out of the war. And Chelsea was particularly vulnerable because of its position by the river. People knew where they were if they were flying up the river. They knew where the docks were, they knew where the mainline stations were, they knew where the power plants were. And all over Chelsea we see that pattern. Planes flying up the river and then branching off to find specific targets. And it's why Chelsea was so badly hit. But on a personal level, what I'd really like you to remember as we walk round is how terrifying this must have been for the residents. Because I know as a historian, we know from the history books, that this was going to finish in around May 1941. But night after night, the terror of hearing engines over your residence, night after night wondering if it was going to be you, living with that kind of stress, that's something we understand much better, the damage that that does. Even if by chance your home isn't damaged, your psyche is damaged. So let's bear that in mind as we track the path of the bombers around Chelsea. V-1 rockets were especially terrifying, not just because they were flying bombs, they had no pilots, they were fired almost at random in the direction of London. They travelled very fast and they had an enormous explosive payload. But as all Londoners came to know, what was most terrifying about them was that you could hear them. And then between 4 and 6 seconds before they were due to land and explode, they went quiet. And it gave you not nearly enough time to try and run to safety. And that's exactly what happened on the 3rd of July, 1944. At 10 to 8 in the morning, almost 100 US service personnel were out on the street, climbing into 6x6 lorries that were going to take them to offices and depots all over and around London, where they were continuing to work on the D-Day advance as it moved through northern France towards Germany. They were in bus queues, effectively. They were climbing up into lorries where some of them were already sitting, packed in for the journey ahead. And when the V-1 rocket hit, they had no time to scramble out. The lorries themselves were thrown up into the air by the force of the blast, and everyone was killed inside. The blast itself killed everyone who was still in the street, and it remains the single greatest loss of US military life on the UK mainland. I brought you here to Dove House Green. This is a little patch of green just off the King's Road where many people come and eat their lunch. And I hope that they notice that on the wall is a simple memorial to the 457 residents of Chelsea who lost their lives during the Blitz. And when you look at that very simple memorial, we should also remember that the Blitz isn't over for the residents of Chelsea in May 1941. That it is going to go on for the remainder of the war. The V-1s, the V-2s, and in February 1944, bombing so hard they became known as the Little Blitz. Just up the road from here, at the corner of Edith Grove and the King's Road, were Guinness Trust buildings. And in February, over 60 people were killed in their homes on one night during the Little Blitz. It's a striking memorial. It's very small, but it uses the same font that they use on the gravestones in France for everyone lost during the First World War. And this, at the end of the day, is Chelsea. It's an artistic borough, and they've drawn on the Picasso image of the dove carrying an olive branch. So all in all, I think this is a very Chelsea memorial. I'm standing outside the Chelsea fire station. There's been a fire station here on the King's Road in Chelsea for most of the 20th century. It was particularly busy and a dangerous place to work during the Blitz in 1940 and 41 and any subsequent bombing in the area. The bombs caused huge fires, and it was up to the firemen to dash out of this fire station, hope that their water supply was still connected, and work sometimes all night to put out the fires. There's a memorial plaque outside the Chelsea fire station which shows the lives of all the firemen who not only lost their lives in the Second World War, but who've also paid the ultimate sacrifice in the decades since then. So we're here at the Royal Hospital, Chelsea. This is the other great masterpiece by the architect Christopher Wren, built in the 17th century after the restoration of the English monarchy. Because the Royal Hospital is right on the edge of the river, it was a target that was easy to define. It was a big building, it had big grounds, and for any bomb aimer in a German aircraft, the thought of such a tempting target was probably too much to bear. If the staff and in-pensioners at the Royal Hospital at Chelsea thought that they had got off relatively lightly from the Blitz that raged across London and Chelsea from 1940 to 1941, unfortunately the events of the 16th of April 1941 were to prove their very worst fears. At 11 o'clock at night, several parachute bombs, they were called landmines at the time, but they were large bombs that exploded when they hit the ground, made direct hits at the Royal Hospital. And this is an extract from a war diary kept from a member of staff that tells of the fear and the terror and the challenges of moving the pensioners to safety. Clouds of dust filled the air, debris fell within 300-yard radius of the infirmary, and the east wing of the hospital was completely destroyed, a large crater occupying the site. The remainder of the infirmary was badly damaged, the roof being removed, though luckily an air raid shelter remained intact. Windows were broken all over the Royal Hospital. Those in the bombed wing were killed outright. They included in-pensioners Rattray, Jackson, Johnson, Sullivan, McGovern, Pope, Cameron and West. And also Sister Taylor, Nurse Ward and Wardmaster Hutchins. Sister McMullen and Sister Nicholson, who were also sheltering under the stairs, were killed. At the outset, work was hampered by a fire, which quickly attained quite big proportions and might have acted as a target. Several tank pumps arrived, some being sent round via the Tite Street entrance. The fire was got under control after about half an hour. Meanwhile, the removal of patients had begun. And I'm telling you this from the crater left behind by one of those bombs. Of course, it isn't a crater now. We were able to use the space that had been cleared to create today's National Army Museum, where the extraordinary commemoration of these events is taking place as part of the Chelsea History Festival. Thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome to the Chelsea History Festival. This year we have a programme filled with some of the best historians, authors and performers. The Chelsea History Festival was set up last year as a joint venture between the National Army Museum, the Royal Hospital Chelsea and the Chelsea Physic Garden. I'm delighted that this year we are sponsored by Cadogan and supported by the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. We are thrilled to be bringing you a special hybrid festival of virtual and physical events. It feels more important than ever to be gathering together to discuss, celebrate, and question our history. And even though we can't be together in the same room, our virtual platform gives us new ways of interacting with the event. So do add comments in the chat bar and ask any questions in the Ask a Question box at the bottom of the screen. And the festival team will put as many of these questions to the speakers as possible at the end of the event. Should we encounter any technical difficulties, please do bear with us. The festival team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you encounter any technical problems at your end. The festival wouldn't be possible without our brilliant historians, authors and speakers. If you can, please support them by buying their brilliant books. There's a green link at the bottom of the screen which will take you through to where you can buy them. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoy the event.
Welcome to the Royal Hospital Chelsea for this session of the Chelsea History Festival. I'm very fortunate I've got with me three very experienced gentlemen who are going to tell us about their life during the Blitz. It's something which, you know, you can read about in books, but it's not the same as meeting someone who's actually experienced it. The Blitz really came as part of the big push of the Battle of Britain. And by coincidence, just about an hour ago, we had 2 Spitfires and 2 Hurricanes of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight flying over to honour the few at the ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Now, the Battle of Britain was Hitler's attempt to try and grind down the RAF through a war of attrition, get the numbers down, succeed by having more aircraft than the opposition, the RAF. And that ran from July until October 1940. But the real reason we're here today is that on the 7th of September 1940, something else began. Hitler's strategists said that they wanted to try and grind down England, and in particular, the people who lived in the capital. And they did 2 things. They switched to bombing the RAF's infrastructure, their airfields, but more importantly, they began to unleash a terror war on London. They called it the Blitz. And if you look at American newsreels of the time, what we always see is a description of plucky Londoners making light of the Blitz. Now, this really didn't work, and it's quite extraordinary because London was bombed systematically for the next 57 days and nights. And most notable was a very large attack on London with hundreds and hundreds of German bombers on the 15th of September. And what is very strange is, despite the weight of the attack, in a way, that is the Blitzkrieg, the lightning attack, it really had very little impact. And when we look back at historians' accounts of the time, what we find is that we didn't have the equivalent of PTSD. They weren't Londoners, as you three know, suffering from what we would call shell shock or aftershock. They just got in with normal life. Progressively, the bombing moved away from London, although it did continue throughout the war, and it moved towards the industrial heartlands. Places like Birmingham, where the majority of our aircraft were being produced. But again, it didn't have the desired effect, with most factories up and running again within less than 3 to 7 days. Now, that isn't to deny the impact of the Blitz. About 40,000 civilians were killed by the Luftwaffe, more than half of them in London. And I think one of the most telling statistics, as I'm sure you're going to tell us, gentlemen, is that over 1 million houses were either destroyed completely or were damaged. And so that big push, the Blitz, we got through it. And we got through it with the plucky determination, the dogged spirit of men like these. I'm going to introduce you to James Little, to Eddie Reed, to Harry Puttick, and to Eddie Reed. Forgive me, gentlemen, I'm hopeless on names. And I think we'd all be fascinated to know, perhaps you could kick us off, James, with where you were and how old you were when the Blitz began.
I'm James.
James.
Yeah, I was 9 at the outbreak of war, and of course the Blitz followed fairly closely after that, 6 months or so. And I lived in, or with my parents, obviously, on the not far from Harrow, between Harrow and Stanmore. And of course, Stanmore was where Bentley Priory was, and Bentley Priory was the headquarters of Fighter Command, which became a target for the German bombers, because that's where Air Marshal Dowding was controlling the Battle of Britain, literally. So once it started, most nights, before it started, we were told there was going to be a bombing attack. And like the rest of my friends here, right, we all helped our fathers dig holes in the garden and put Anderson shelters in and so on and so forth. And then when it started in earnest, right, that's where we spent most of our nights, either that or in the cupboard under the stairs, depending on, what the circumstances were. And you could tell the German aircraft by the distinctive drone of their engines. And you could, if you were outside, which you didn't want to be, searchlights were going and all that ack-ack was going on. And in the morning, the pavements and streets would be littered with large lumps of metal that were the fragments of the anti-aircraft fire that had come whistling down. So there were two hazards, really. There were the bombs the Germans were going to drop, and there's large lumps of jagged metal that was coming down from the shells that the anti-aircraft people fired at them. And that was, to us, me at 9 years old, I mean, this was a case of finding the biggest lump and swapping it when you went to school, you know, so on and so forth. So I done it off. Yeah.
Harry, do you remember building an Anderson shelter?
Yes, I do. We dug the hole and we got it all fitted out. Luckily, our garden was dry, so it wasn't as if it was going to flood. And making it up, putting in the bunks and doing it and trying to make it comfortable, if you could say that. But yes, I remember that very well. Very interesting time too. And everybody was sort of digging their gardens up. And I also remember watching it. I went to the cinema, and of course, all the people outside London were coming in, and they were digging trenches in Hyde Park and everything as anti-aircraft shelters. But I don't know whether they were really effective in the overall thing, but the Anderson shelters certainly were. And there was a modicum of comfort as well.
How long did it take to go up?
To build it? I didn't do it on my own. My dad built it. I was just handing bits of stuff. I think it took us best part of an afternoon.
Really?
Or, you know, when I say afternoon, up to about 10 o'clock at night, because that was it. If we didn't get too many air raid sirens going off, and we couldn't really dive into the shelter because we still had bits to tighten up, you know. But no, I remember that very well.
Did you have one, Eddie?
An Anderson shelter, definitely. Yeah, oh, yes. But Daddy didn't have to dig it himself. Our council had gangs of men going around the town where we lived, and they dug the hole, fitted the corrugated iron Anderson shelter. I always remember it depended on the number of persons in the household, how big the Anderson shelter would be. We had one of the largest because I had 3 siblings and my mother and father, so we had one of the larger ones. But Harry is right, actually. Most of the time, we were trying to make the shelter habitable with little bits and pieces which we could... and initially, there were no bunks available. It was only when the Blitz really started that the local council decided to put bunks in. And we had bunks to enable us to sleep in there all night, if it was necessary.
And were they comfortable?
I don't remember being uncomfortable. Seriously, I don't remember, but I was young. I was 11 when the war started. And maybe it's a part of youth. Nothing will happen to me, you know. And looking back on it, it must have been frightening, but I can't really recall ever being frightened.
How did your mother how did your mother treat having to go into the Anderson shelter every night? Was it a chore for her, do you think?
Yeah, I think for an adult it probably was, because, as you know, the bunks they were pretty primitive things. For us, being smaller, right, you know, you could fit in almost anywhere, but for an adult it was pretty... Yeah. I mean, they weren't all that long, these Anderson shelters, you know, 7 foot, something like that, you know, so... Yeah. You've got a 6 foot father, you know, his head's banging at one end and his feet are banging at the other. And of course, one above the other, right? And of course, it's if the person in the top bunk was rather heavy, the person in the underneath bunk, right, didn't have much headroom. No. But I think the thing, I don't know about the others, but my father always kept a little box in which he had his emergency supplies, right? You know, key amongst them, of course, was a bottle of brandy. You know, just if things got a bit too hot, you know, we'll have a little calming down sup, you know, not me, but Mum and Dad did. Yeah, so it's but they were they were very effective in their way because they were covered with partially buried in the ground and then covered with the soil that you dug out the hole. So short of a direct hit, you were pretty safe from any fragments that were flying around, and there were a lot of fragments flying around.
Does anyone remember a neighbour's house taking a direct hit?
Not a neighbour. In our road, we had one high explosive bomb which dropped on the road and destroyed 3 houses. Wow. But that was the only high explosive bomb or event which we had. We had incendiaries subsequently, but that was when 3 houses were destroyed. Everybody else had their windows blown in for the blast. But as I say, you went to school in the next morning without any problem.
And did you have special lessons at school for how to react if there was a bombing raid during the day?
I can't
remember that.
I can't remember having any special.
The only special lesson was, when the siren went, get in the shelter.
In the shelter, that was it, yeah.
And presumably you all carried a little box with your gas mask.
Right, yeah.
Yes. Yes, that little square box.
Bit of string and a cardboard box.
I'm always amazed that those things lasted for so long.
Well, they didn't, but that you could buy little boxes.
Small industry.
Put it in,
Small industry grew up.
Yeah.
Patterned covers so that the ladies wouldn't look out of with just a cardboard box around their shoulders. They had patterned covers for them, Oh yeah.
Do you know, I remember as a child playing with one of those gas masks.
Yeah.
And realising that very quickly they're quite claustrophobic.
Oh yeah.
And they make you sweat.
Yeah.
And the rubber smelt a bit.
Yeah.
It wasn't a very pleasant experience.
No.
I think the important thing to get a perspective on is that the flight path of the German aircraft. I mean, to start off with, they attacked the docks, the London docks. So it was Wapping and the East End and the London docks. And then eventually, of course, they decided on that the broader population was just as good a target as well. So, but they used to fly up Thames, which is because flying up the Thames at leading to London. And then once, if you think of the geography of it, once they dropped their bombs or whatever on London, then they'd all turn to go home. And invariably, they turned round over where we were living, over Harrow, Wales, that part of it, northwest London. And anything was left over, they dropped. So it's, they'd have 2 bites of the cherry, for want of a better term. One they'd bomb London, and if it was got a bit crowded over the skies and some of them had something left, they'd drop it on us at the same time, especially if they were having to go at Bentley Prior, as they say.
I remember reading that probably the biggest landmark in London at the time was Battersea Power Station. And you really couldn't miss it in daylight. With the big stacks.
Yeah.
Very large building and very important to the economy, the infrastructure of London. Yet it was never hit.
I was just going to say, I was never sure whether that actually suffered any damage, and I don't think it did. I don't think it did. I'm not going to say that the bombing was indiscriminate, but where I lived, we had a Royal Small Arms factory, but it was several miles from where we lived, but that was where the Bren gun was made. That's where the EN comes in, being made in the Royal Small Arms factory in Enfield. But I cannot recall, that would have been a target for the German. I cannot recall ever hearing that the Small Arms factory had been attacked any night during the Blitz.
And yet, strangely, in bright light, they could have followed the River Lee.
Well, yes,
London.
Exactly.
They could have also gone to Hatfield and bombed.
Exactly. Oh yeah.
The air factories there.
But then they didn't really need the river to find their way into London because of Croydon Airport. They were in and out of Croydon Airport right the way through the 30s, weren't they? Yeah. So
at the same time, I do honestly believe their policy was to scare the population.
Oh yeah.
Into submission,
right, yeah.
or
yeah.
Do you know what I would find hardest as someone from a slightly younger generation is not having the choice of food. And during the Blitz, you must have had some terribly narrow choices of food. Do you remember what you were eating on a daily basis?
Well, the rationing but
Cauliflower cheese?
yeah, but there again, you see, we've been told afterwards we were never healthier.
That's
We were
right.
having healthier eating habits than we had since the war. They've disappeared. You know, I forget how many ounces of butter a week, or
No fruit.
no, it was not a banana, not a banana.
Not a banana.
It was only-
Apples.
Apples in season, but
Yeah.
oranges, bananas, anything like that.
Do you know, I remember a story of someone who cried
Yeah.
when they had their first orange.
Yeah.
The war was over.
Oh,
And the supplies were coming back.
well, seriously, when the Americans came over into the war in 1942, this was headlines in the papers where they were holding up bananas in
Spam.
the air. You know, this is,
Spam, tins of spam.
Spam.
Yeah.
Spam.
oh, I still miss it. I still miss it.
Now, could you get round Russian books? Was there a way of getting supplies during the
Well,
Blitz?
Not really.
Ask me, I was too young. I didn't deal with it. I'm sure my mother had a few
There
wrinkles
was,
up her sleeve.
you know, every mother, every housewife always flung her charms at the grocer, the butcher, for a little bit extra. There's your coupons, you know, but can we have another? It happened all the time, of course, you know. But,
I think the interesting thing to remember is that throughout all of this, the infrastructure of London suffered but didn't fail.
yes,
Tubes ran, the railways ran,
Yep.
the electric,
Agreed.
the gas supply stayed on.
I agree.
So all the utilities, right, and the people that ran the utilities, right, did a fantastic job to keep everything up and running.
So who was clearing up the mess the next morning?
Everybody.
Everybody.
Oh yeah.
Just a community effort.
Yeah.
Well,
I used to go round with a couple of workmen, right? You know,
when it
a
was-
young lad. They had their bag of tools, and, you know, banging wooden frames over windows and stretching the old, you know, polythene, not polythene because it didn't basically
Didn't have it then,
exist,
did they?
celluloid sheets or sheets of plywood where the windows had been blown out.
James has a theory.
Great fun.
Tell me your theory about national car parks.
Oh yeah, I mean the big, fantastic business success story, of course, is National Car Park. Because after the war, or during the war even, National Car Parks cleared the bomb sites
Right.
and started using them as car parks.
Car parks.
So if you think about it now, the Blitz, the sites of the Blitz still exist in London. Because go to a national car park, and it used to be a block of flats or houses or a warehouse that was bomb flat.
And presumably very cheap to buy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you know the Blitz straddled a Christmas, 1940 and 1941. Does anyone remember anything about their Christmas during the Blitz?
Other than the fact it was pretty austere.
It was austere.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, Christmas was still celebrated.
Yes.
But,
It was always looked forward to.
yeah.
If there wasn't enough food at the time, how did you make it feel Christmassy?
There wasn't enough food, Neil, but the point was that it was not Christmas food. You didn't have... I think my mother made a Christmas pudding
Yeah.
and didn't make a Christmas cake because of obviously the decoration. But they made do and mend, and we all got used to that. I think that's where it came from, wasn't it? Bake, do and mend.
Yeah.
True, Harry. But I cannot recall a Christmas during the war when we didn't have a turkey or a goose or something like that. A lot of it came over from Ireland, oddly enough. They used to have special planes bringing the stuff over on the boats. But there was always turkey. A lot of it was from Ireland coming over, you know.
So did the government make a special effort to keep spirits up?
They did.
Oh, yeah.
By bringing the stuff into
Oh,
London?
yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. There was
There was a lot of morale building stuff going on with
Indeed.
posters and everything else.
Indeed, James.
And I think this is the key thing about the infrastructure. The railway still worked. Excuse me. The railway still worked. The buses worked. The trams worked. You know, the tube worked throughout the whole of it. They had problems. They got bombed. They got damaged. They got repaired, and they went back. And I think this is probably something that Mr. Adolf on the other side didn't actually bargain for. He thought that once he bombed it, he'd destroy the morale, but he did not affect the morale one way. In fact, if anything, he strengthened it.
And of course, we had those amazing bomb shelters, the underground stations.
Yes.
Yeah.
When I look at pictures from that period, there are two that strike home for me. The first is St. Paul's Cathedral, standing proudly with damage all around it and the smoke, but untouched. Yeah. And you might think perhaps God's looking after his cathedral, but the other thing is people sleeping in their hundreds in underground stations.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to imagine people just settling into that as the norm.
It was
with
part
complete strangers.
It was part of life, and they adapted to it. And in fact, there was some sense of enjoyment going down to the tube shelters at night and picking a spot where you were going to lie. Really. But James led during the war when the keeping the morale up. I still remember the half a dozen slogans that existed during the war.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Don't forget there's a war on. Don't talk. Keep
Careless
calm.
talk,
Right, yeah.
lives.
Loose lips cost lives, yeah, and all that sort of thing.
All these slogans were
Keep calm and carry on.
Yeah, keep
dig
calm.
for victory, dig for victory.
Yeah, and big
We're doing
pictures
that
of
now,
Churchill
aren't we?
doing this with cigar stuffed in his
I
mouth.
see you mentioned Dig for Victory.
Yes.
There was this enormous push to dig up football pitches,
Oh, yeah.
public parks.
That's right.
It wasn't just gardens.
Every plot of land, spare land, was used to produce vegetables and everything like that.
I mean, the biggest park in London, Hyde Park.
Yeah.
Yes.
It had bomb shelters and it also had big allotments, big gardens, turned over to vegetable
Yeah,
gardens.
absolutely.
Interesting you mentioned the bomb shelters, because the less luxurious shelters were the brick ones that were built in all the streets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they built a lot of them. And they were like brick block, oblong brick block houses. Not very pleasant places to spend any time in, I must confess.
Did they work, by the way? Were they effective?
I think if a bomb landed anywhere within 50
Would have
yards
gone.
of them, they didn't work very well at all.
They wouldn't have survived a direct hit or a near miss.
I mean, we'd have had to go, because I came from Croydon, so they've no undergrounds, no nothing there, really. So it would just be a case that if you didn't have an Anderson shelter, God knows where you went. You knew where these things were, these brick-built shelters, but you doubted them, really, I think, don't really fancy that.
I mean, got a bit blasé,
I was
really.
10 years old. I mean, what would I know about it? But I just looked and I thought, no, thanks.
You always felt safe in an Anderson shelter because you were half underground.
That's
and,
right.
But for people who don't know what an Anderson shelter is, and when I grew up, they were everywhere.
Yeah.
And in a lot of cases, the earth had gone. But it's just a very flimsy piece of tin.
It's
Corrugated
iron. Corrugated iron. Listen,
Power of the earth, it worked.
absolutely.
Oh, it worked.
Absolutely,
It was
both
there to support the earth, you dug out the hole.
And also, rather like an egg.
Yeah.
The round shape is very strong.
Absolutely.
And generated a lot of condensation.
Exactly.
Later on, during the war, they introduced Morrison Shelters,
Yeah.
which were for inside the house.
Yeah.
It doubled up as a table, perhaps, during the day. But at night, if there was a raid on, or the family was underneath the... These were steel, really good quality steel. Heavy.
It was, yeah.
There is a funny side to things, though. My mother and father were very keen solo whist players, and their Saturday night was two of their friends had come and they set up their solo school. And they'd sit round the table in the front room, where only used for visitors and Christmas. And if the sirens went, right, then that was the signal to do something. I got oiked out of bed, downstairs, and because it was Saturday night in the car school, I was in the cupboard under the stairs, because that was recommended as being the strongest part of the house. And I can remember peeping out through the door and seeing 4 backsides sticking out from under this table, where they'd got their heads under, but the rest of them couldn't get in there. That's stuck in my memory all my life.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Was any one of you evacuated?
Yes,
No, I wasn't.
You weren't? Because
I
you were
wasn't.
too far away, presumably.
Well, no. Mum, we had the opportunity of being evacuated, but Mother and Father said, no, we remain as a family. If we go, we'll go as one unit. that was their thinking.
Well, I was evacuated and I went on the 4th of September, which was the day after war was declared. And I got on the train with all the others, a little gas mask in my hand and a bag of whatever they had in the other.
And a label.
Yeah, and a label,
Yes, exactly, the label.
And they all had those.
Yeah.
But anyway, my destination, I found out, was Brighton. They were sending me to be closer to the Germans than my family were, And anyway, we had that. And after being in Brighton for about 4 months, getting through that bad winter of
40.
We went from there to another really safe place, Camberley, near the Staff College. And I thought, this is no game, this. But I stayed there for another 3 months, I think, and I said to my mum, come on, I want to come home, please.
James, did you? Were you?
Yeah, I went to East Grinstead, but I didn't last as long as Harry. After a fortnight, I'd had enough. I was back home. It was being evacuated was not the most pleasant of experiences because there you were with a whole load of strangers who weren't really interested in you particularly.
Other snotty-nosed kids.
Yeah.
Were they paid to look after you?
Sorry?
Were they paid to look after you?
Oh,
You know what, I don't really know.
Oh, yeah, they were.
I think they had to pay them, yeah.
Yeah.
But the life in the country was totally different to the life in London.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I think we were generally regarded as
Oh, there were,
London snotty-nosed
really some great cartoons in the newspapers about evacuees from London being in the country and looking at a clutch of eggs and saying that's a hen's nest or
Now, I mentioned before that because of the Battle of Britain, we had those 2 Spitfires and 2 Hurricanes over. A wonderful sound, as we all know. And somebody mentioned that when you heard the sound of a Spitfire, you knew you were safe.
Yes.
If you heard the sound of a German plane, and you knew a Heinkel or whatever, you'd have to run like hell.
But there was,
But you've been up in a Spitfire.
yeah.
Tell us about that.
And I can assure you, it's built for 18-year-old fighter pilots. It's not built for, fat old people like me.
It wasn't that long ago, was it?
No, it was 18 months, thereabouts. Fantastic airplane, but you've got to remember, the bombing raids were mainly at night. Very few daylight raids. The daylight raids didn't come until the doodlebugs later on and the V2s and that sort of thing, which, if anything, were probably a bit more terrifying than the Blitz itself because you never had damn V2s coming. But
Tell us about what it's like when you're in the rear seat of a Spitfire. Are you thrown around?
no, there's not enough room to be thrown around. It's a very tight fit. I mean, these guys that say it fits you like an overcoat or a suit, are absolutely right. I mean, it's almost as though the aircraft is built round you. There's not a lot. I mean, you can move your feet, right? You can do the control stick, and you've just got this dashboard with all these instruments in front of you, and that's it.
And you could see the speed you were going at, couldn't you?
Oh yeah. You can see how fast you were.
How fast did you go?
Oh, you got about 250 odd miles an hour, I suppose, something like that. I mean, this was a pleasure flight. It wasn't nothing in earnest about it. We weren't going to shoot at anybody, but a fabulous experience. I mean, it's an iconic aircraft.
Somebody said to me that the strange thing about flying a Spitfire is that you can't hear the sigh of the Merlin because the air just rushes past you.
Yeah.
So you can hear the air,
Yeah.
you can't hear the engine so loudly.
You can hear it when it starts up and takes off, and when you come back, you can hear it. But I mean, the interesting thing is the takeoff and landing. I mean, maybe it's not a three-wheeled aircraft; it's 2. So the pilot's looking out the front of the cockpit like this, taking off and landing. I mean, when you think that these guys, right? They were what, 18, 19 years old. They come out of school or college or wherever it was they were. They were in a Spitfire in combat after 5 hours training on a Harvard or something like that. the attrition rate of the pilots in the Battle of Britain was very, very high indeed.
And we know those youngsters, the really young ones, going up for the first couple of times,
Yeah.
they exhausted their ammunition straight away.
Well,
It meant that when they were challenged,
Yeah.
they literally couldn't fight back.
There was, I think that the thing was that they 2-second bursts, and they'd get off something like 100 rounds in 2 seconds. You know, you've got to take your hat off to the young men of those days. You know, and sometimes I walk down the King's Road and look at the young men of these days and do a little bit of a comparison.
I think it's the hardest thing for all of us, looking back, who didn't experience what you did, how it could all become a normality. That every night you would know that you'd go to bed,
Oh yeah.
whether
Very
in your
true.
house or in the Anderson shelter,
Very true.
and you were going to be woken up.
Yeah, very true.
But the other point's worth making is the Spitfires didn't fly at night. Right? The night fighters, right, which are probably twin-engine aircraft, like bow fighters or something, right, were down on the coast trying to stop them getting to London. The people over London, it was mainly anti-aircraft fire, searchlights and anti-aircraft guns. And
Cat's Eyes Cunningham as well, didn't we?
oh yeah,
Yeah, he was there.
yeah.
He was an ace who took down quite a lot of planes.
He was a night fighter.
Night fighter pilot.
Yeah. He was a night fighter, which
But when James said about the planes coming at night, I remember seeing them at the daytime in the early days, and there was stacks of them coming
yeah.
up. And, you know, the bombers were there and the fighters coming in and out. And then you saw about 3 of our blokes diving in amongst them.
correct. That is correct.
It was really fantastic. That was the fantastic part of the Blitz, is that how the fighter pilots sort of
Summer of
controlled it.
1940.
It was a concerted effort by the Luftwaffe.
Yeah.
They put up as many planes as they could in order to subdue, particularly London, the population of London.
Well, I mean, the statistics prove it. You know,
James did
the Germans crossed the Atlantic from the Pas de Calais to Dover in 8 minutes. From takeoff to get into fighting altitude, 20-odd thousand feet for a Spitfire, was 15. So these guys had to get the height. I mean, the rules of World War I air combat still applied. Height and out of the sun.
And of course, in the days of the big wing, Barder's big wing,
Yeah,
it was even more chaos.
that's right.
Trying to assemble all those squadrons up at various layers
That's right.
before moving over.
Yeah.
So you probably needed an hour warning,
Yeah.
which they normally didn't have.
It's-
You mentioned before V1s and V2s, and they made a huge difference because it wasn't the noise, was it?
No.
You worried about when there was no noise.
Well, there was with the V1, the Doodlebug.
Yeah.
It's when the noise stopped, you had to
Yes,
worry.
they would just drop.
That's right. But the rockets, the V2s, you just
They weren't.
all of a sudden it's just a massive explosion and a whole row of houses would disappear, and that was it.
For them.
And the same with the landmines, wasn't it? When
Yeah.
Oh, the landmines were
In the
disastrous.
normal raid, they used to come down by parachute.
Landmine, you know, devastator, a whole street.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, where the other bombs took out a house or 2 houses.
Yeah.
They took out the
Landmine.
whole
Yeah, they're big, weren't they? Yeah.
Do you remember how, for the V1s, a good Spitfire pilot
That's right.
fly alongside?
Yeah.
And
Tip the
you
wings.
didn't actually touch. It was just
Yeah.
air pressure.
They
He would nudge his wing up like that,
Yeah.
and then the V1 would just roll
Turn
over,
around.
go on a different course.
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, with the V2s, we were very lucky because we were controlling agents who were sending back false information about successes. So we were increasingly able to push those V2s away from London. And so they were landing, crashing in areas of lower population. But clearly, some were still getting through.
Oh, yeah.
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 Oh, a lot got through. A lot got through. I think, yeah, it's. But that was later. I mean, that's a couple of years later. So that was almost a second Blitz, if you like, but a technological one. Right? Men weren't involved. Nobody flying these things.
That's a very good point there, James. My grandfather, he used to go up onto a railway bridge quite near to where we lived and used to stand there with a steel helmet on. What he did that for, I have no idea. But he stood all the way, didn't care about the raid or the shrapnel or anything like that. And then come the doodlebugs, he was terrified. He could not understand how these things could fly with no one in them. You know, the technology hadn't caught up with my granddad.
Do you know, when you read of what if you watch Dad's Army and you think of the rather cranky and bad-tempered air raid warning.
Oh, yeah.
Those guys were doing a really important job.
Oh, they were
and in
fantastic.
quite a lot of danger at night.
Well, a lot of the air raid wardens, of course, were veterans from World War One. I mean, my father was an air raid warden. And I mean, they put their helmets on and their little ARP bomber jacket and went out and kept watch for things.
Well, where I lived, there was a St John's ambulance man next door to me, and next to his house was a fireman and his wife. His wife was a dispatcher on the where the fires were to send the brigades to. You know? So we had a fair share down our street, but luckily only the back of my house was blown out.
Yeah.
The window and bits of the
There weren't many houses that didn't lose their windows one way or another.
They all got something, didn't they?
That's right.
Could you get glass replacements easily? Or did they just have to suffer with blocked up windows?
No, I don't know.
Sort of cellophane and that sort of thing.
Yeah, there was glass available, I think.
And it
but,
was very
not in huge quantities.
Tar paper was the tar paper.
tar
Had the
paper.
thing for.
The repairmen came around very quickly. It was very obvious to me that when the windows were blown in, the next day,
Yeah,
somebody was
usually.
around to fix it in some way or other. You
And
know?
that was the Department of Public Works, was it?
Yeah.
Well, it was
wherever.
local town council, but obviously, you know,
They must have been really busy, those guys.
Oh, they were.
They never stopped. No.
They were all guys that were either unfit for military service or too old for military service, and I mean they were just as important as anybody else. I mean, at the end of the day, you could, just try living in a house where all the windows have gone. It can get quite drafty, and the rain blows in and things like that.
I mean, what strikes me is that many of those people were doing a job during the day
That's right.
oh, absolutely.
and then doing a complete night shift
That's right.
5 times a week.
And we, sorry, Harry, in our street, we had patrol all night. This was to warn people about incendiary attacks and put out that light if somebody showed a glimpse of,
yeah.
you know. But that was every 2 hours the patrol changed.
Yeah.
And we used to have a logbook where we put in any incidents. So everybody chipped in.
My maternal grandmother lived in the Blackfriars Road, right, just down from Waterloo Station, and I can remember going up there with my father, right, because as I say earlier, the tube still ran, right, and going to see if he wanted to go and see if she was all right, and literally going down the Blackfriars Road, we would climb all around by the old Vic and the cut, climbing over rubble. I mean, London was in a bit of a mess in those days.
Did any of you, or have you still got a souvenir from that time?
I had in one incendiary attack, we happened to get what was left of a bomb, an incendiary bomb, and my father took it to into work, and it was silvered and left, and for years that sat on the mantelpiece of our house, and then I joined the army, and all those disappeared. You know.
Yeah.
Did the house burn down?
Sorry?
Did the house burn down with the firebomb on the mantelpiece?
Now, all of you, from memory, joined up, around 46, 47?
Yeah.
Is that right?
1945.
45?
Yeah. I was 46.
But you joined after the war ended.
I joined as a boy in 1940,
As boys.
September 1945.
And what was it like being in the army when the war was over?
3 shillings a day, I remember, was
Good God, you were rich.
3 shillings a day. And
Woodbines was sixpence for a packet of fire.
I enlisted at the end of 1945, but that would have meant I would have had to go boy service, and which meant that my parents had to agree, and they wouldn't agree. So I was put on the reserve in 1945, and then when I reached the age of 17 and a half, I think it was, in March the following year, I was called up for my basic training.
And that was the Inniskillen Fusiliers, isn't it?
Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, yeah.
And how long did you stay in the army? How long did you stay?
I was there 6 years. 6 years.
Right.
Yeah.
And what was your experience?
I went to what they call the Army Apprenticeship School at Chepstow down in Monmouth.
Engineer.
Yeah.
Right.
So I did a 3-year general engineering apprenticeship, and I came into the Royal Engineers in 1948. When a lot of the guys that had been discharged from the war, because there was very little work, were coming back in. And so the trade that I spent 3 years learning was basically redundant. So I had to had an opportunity to remuster, and I chose to become a refrigeration mechanic. Right? In 1948, refrigeration was pretty primitive, and that was a decision that I now look back on and think it changed the whole of my military life, because I never always went on individual posts. I went where refrigeration was needed.
And that's why you saw the nuclear blast, presumably?
Well, part of it, yeah, because, I mean, don't get me, I mean, Christmas Island it was a military establishment, but it was not military in the way that people think about it. There was no parades, there was no polished boots, there was no nothing. Everybody was doing a specific job. Engineers were engineering, cooks were cooking, you know.
And it was hot.
Yeah, MT guys were repairing vehicles, and nobody polished their boots.
What was your experience, Harry, when you joined up?
Well, I joined up as a van boy in 1946, 1st of August, and I was posted to Wrexham in North Wales. I think it was the first time I'd ever been anywhere above the Thames, you know, to the north of the Thames, and got to Wrexham, and after a couple of days, the bandmaster said to me, "What instrument do you want to play, Puttick?" So I said, "Oh, want to play a trumpet, sir, because my father used to play a trumpet." He said, "I've got enough trumpets here. There's a clarinet and a tutor. Go and learn it." And that was it, my introduction to the Royal Welsh Fusiliers Band in 1946.
Fantastic.
But things looked up after that. It was a great regiment and a great bunch of lads I was with. So
How long were you in?
I was in for 30 years.
Really?
That's a lie. It's a few days short, but adding on the days hurts my brain. So I think we'll just leave it there.
Now, we started this session late because we had a few technical issues. But we've got questions coming in from the real world out there.
Oh, yeah.
And Nicola Arton, she says, has your experience of the Blitz affected you into adult life?
Certainly hadn't. I cannot
No,
record. No, it hasn't. It hasn't. It hasn't.
no, it
I was going to say, in what respect?
Basically, it was a case of getting on with it.
I mean, I don't jump when things go bang, if that's what...
No.
Yeah,
No, I don't.
Not really.
Well, as I said before, I mean, I think the Germans were surprised. It wasn't just that Londoners were plucky. They somehow shrugged off the mental effects of that
Yeah.
constant aerial bombing at night.
Yeah, and then they switched out into the places like Birmingham and Southampton, Plymouth, Liverpool, Manchester. So really, a lot of the stuff had been absorbed in London, but we weren't any worse off than what the other people, and they don't look as if they've had any ill effects after it, or even decent effects. They just go on with their lives. Which
Someone else is asking whether your experience in the Blitz made you want to join the army. I mean, did you want to, fight back, do your bit? Is that why you joined the army?
Well, age had to come into it, of course, but it was always my ambition to join the army, even when I was a young 11-year-old, 12-year-old. I'd always considered the army or being a soldier as being a vocation, just as much as any other profession. So, rightly or wrongly, that was my.
Well, out of 3 sons and a daughter that my parents had, I was the youngest, and I was the only one that was not in uniform. One brother in the army, one brother in the RAF, and my sister was in the Navy. And quite frankly, I couldn't wait to get into the army. I wanted to join the army anyway. Yeah. My father was a military man. He was cavalry in World War I. And at the end of the day, right, I couldn't wait to get in. And like Harry, I mean, I did 25 years, and I don't regret a single day of it. It gave me very good qualifications. got a very good job when I left the army, and I have no regrets at all.
No, Craig.
And I'd commend it to some of the young men today.
No, that's what I was going to ask you, James, whether you think that more people should join up.
Well, the army is a very technical place to be, regardless.
Yeah.
Just remember that, the statistics still apply. For every one guy in the front line carrying a rifle, it takes 10 behind him, right, to make sure he's properly equipped, maintained, and everything else. So there are massive opportunities for very, very good education in the army.
And as an engineer, you would know that we now have the most amazing complex kit.
Yeah.
Aircraft that can do the job of 50 aircraft.
Right.
Excellent. Yeah.
Now, I'm going to ask you a bit of an awkward question, because the governor may be watching this. What's the best thing about being a Chelsea pensioner?
I think it's not having anything to worry about. I mean, think of this place. I mean, it's an incredible building. It's an incredible history. You are among kindred spirits. I mean, we all sit here. There's no case of not. We've all been there, done it, and got the T-shirt. Let's put it that way. And at the end of the day, you recognise that. We looked after remarkably well. I sleep like a log every night because I don't have to worry about maintaining a house, mowing the grass, or anything like that.
Oh, that's right.
And it's
What about you, Harry?
it takes your worries away.
Similar likewise, yeah. I mean, personally, I think it's a no-brainer for people who are left on their own.
Absolutely.
And they feel on their own.
It's camaraderie.
You need, yes, the camaraderie and the banter that we say amongst ourselves, you know.
Oh yeah, don't come up here with a thin
We
skin.
all do plenty of that. But, yeah, it's a good place to come and be looked after, because we are looked after, particularly through this nasty period we're going through now.
Indeed.
I don't want to sort of get brownie points, but I think the governor's got it on the nail.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Totally agree. And we did lose 10 people to COVID,
Yeah.
but that was at the very beginning of the,
Exactly.
and one would harshly say to be expected.
Yeah.
But touching wood, we've been clear ever since.
And you know that those numbers are fantastic when you compare them to the outside world.
Oh, yeah,
Yes.
agree.
I mean, I know one of the philosophies here
Yeah.
is about well-being. I mean, you mentioned you're well-fed, but fitness is important here, both mental and physical fitness.
But there's also a certain amount of discipline here, which we all have been used to in our serving years. And of course, it applies to washing your hands and all the things that we have to do to prevent the spread of the COVID.
Self-discipline is the important factor.
Agreed.
That we, say, that's it, do it. Not everybody likes to do it, but I can't say there's some things I don't like, but then again, that happens to everybody, doesn't it? In any life.
I was inspired by watching colleagues living in, working 7 days a week, 12 to 14-hour days,
Yeah.
everyone mucking in and helping, and one huge family.
Yeah.
And I wonder, do you think this is the legacy of your military career? Because in the military, you learn to support each other. You look after your brother in arms, or your
That's
sister
an
in arms.
essential element of being in the army.
Yeah, if
You don't have to necessarily like
If
the
you
man
can't
standing
take
next
it,
to you,
innit?
but you support him, and
I think we all joined the army as very young men. I joined as a boy. Eddie joined as a boy. So when you come to the end of your life, and I'm not being morbid here, but when you come to your later years, let's put it that way, you're living alone, because at the end of the day, one of the prerequisites, your family's grown up, your wife is unfortunately gone, or for whatever reason. What better place to be? You start young and join the army. You live in the army. You may have gone out into civil life and had another. I mean, I did 25 years in industry, right? And I left the army in 1970. But I was sitting in my house down in Hampshire one day, and I looked out the window and thought, here I am, in my middle 80s. I don't really want to mow the grass anymore. I don't want to lay in bed when the wind's blowing like stinking, worrying if I'm going to go in the following day to get the tiles fixed. Why don't I go back and, apply to go to Chelsea and go back to where I began.
That's
Do
right.
you know, one of the things that inspires me is knowing that every one of you still gives something back.
Oh, yeah.
You all fundraise, you all support local charities, people speak to school children to educate them about the war and the Blitz in particular, I think, because you can somehow meet minds if you're of a similar age to them as you were during the Blitz.
That's
And
right.
that's really important.
I think it's an important point, because I think we would all agree that the one thing during this COVID crisis that we miss is the interaction with the public. We miss the people that come up and say, can we look around the hospital?
Yeah.
We miss meeting people when we walk around Ranelagh Gardens.
Absolutely.
The little old ladies that come in and sit there and you can sit and have a chat with them, you know. It'd be good when we can get out and start talking to people again.
Well, I mean, I cross my fingers it's soon, but I think we have a little bit further to go. One of the great things about the Royal Hospital is tradition, isn't it?
Oh,
And
yeah.
it goes back over 300 years. And,
Exactly.
you know, it's amazing when you can show people what the births used to be like and what they are now. But this isn't a place that stands still. It's a place that wants to reach out to the outside world.
Absolutely.
And the question I've been asked here is on my iPad. You know, how important is it that we capture conversations like the one we've had this afternoon for posterity, for the future? You know, we all will come and go, and yet this is a really important part of our national history, that period through 1940, 1941, when things could have gone very badly wrong.
True.
And the numbers of,
yeah.
for example, aircraft during the Battle of Britain and then through the Blitz, they were pretty finely balanced on both sides. So it could have gone either way. So do you think we should capture more of these conversations?
Yeah.
Yeah, why not?
I think we do, in another sense, within the hospital ourselves. We go out to other events and converse with people who we meet. It hasn't been such as we've had here this afternoon, but I take your point, Noel. It's vital, I think, that such experiences should be put on record. And
A chap called a military historian called Saul David wrote a very good book called Victoria's Small Wars, and it's about Queen Victoria and her reign and the small wars she had, not the big ones, the small ones. Well, somebody ought to write a book about Queen Elizabeth's small wars, because at the moment a lot of it is overshadowed by Afghanistan and Iraq and so on and so forth. But most of us here that live here have been involved in campaigns that got very little publicity. A lot of people didn't even know about them. And yet, right, everybody here, in one form or another, has at some time or another been in harm's way.
Do you know what always sticks in my mind is that there's only been, I think, 1 year since 1945
Correct.
we have not been at war.
That's
Right.
right.
In a small or a big campaign, but we've been engaged all the time. And that's something we should be proud about. Isn't it?
Right.
Yes.
it's so true. Both world wars, 1418, 39-45, were both designated as the war to end all wars. And yet, wars have been... here I'm bringing politics into it.
No, don't do that.
No.
I've got my head hurts when you do that.
But we've been at war, and you're right, Noel. Only 1 year has there been no conflict anywhere in Europe, across the world. You know,
I'm going to cut it there. I hope that you've got a flavour from this delightful conversation with these three wonderful colleagues here about their experiences during the Blitz. And it was a long time ago, but I think we've had huge clarity about what that experience was like and just living through real adversity. So I'd like to thank Harry, James and Eddie for some superb contributions. You've absolutely been fantastic. I've learnt a lot, and more importantly, I've really enjoyed this three-way conversation. And thank you for watching this session of the Chelsea History Festival.